Tonight, we dive into a case file the police tried to close, but the witnesses, the survivors, couldn't. This is a story about the American dream consumed by a sudden fire and 5 young souls who vanished without a trace. The case of the Sodder family disappearance is a scar on the history of American crime. It makes you question everything you trust, and it makes you wonder, can fire truly die, or is it just a perfect cover for something far more sinister? Fayetteville, West Virginia, 1945. The Sodder family was the quintessential American success story. George, Jennie, and their 9 children living in a cozy, 2-story wooden home, a symbol of the prosperity George had fought for. It was Christmas Eve. The house was warm, smelling of pine and pie, a fortress against the cold Appalachian winter. The younger 5, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie, and little Betty, were still awake. But the peace was broken at 12:30 a.m. when Marion, the eldest daughter, was awakened by a strange late-night phone call from a woman asking for a person Marion didn't know. Marion hung up, noticing the living room lights were blazing, and simply turned them off. Just 30 minutes later, around 1 a.m., Jennie Sodder woke again, this time to a soft metallic thud on the roof, followed by a light rolling sound. She dismissed it as wind, but when she checked, she found the living room lights were inexplicably on again. Another strange warning she chose to ignore. The real terror hit at 2 a.m. Jennie's scream woke the house as she smelled thick, choking smoke and heard the furious crackle of fire directly beneath the children's upstairs bedrooms. George rushed out with Jennie and 4 of the children, but 5 were trapped upstairs. Desperate, George was immediately crippled. His well-maintained work truck would not start, and the 20-foot wooden ladder, which was always kept leaning against the house, had vanished without a trace. He was a strong man, utterly helpless, watching his life burn in the snow. Then came the moment that sealed their fate. Jennie looked up at Maurice's window and swore she saw a faint light inside, like someone standing there looking out, before the curtain was quickly drawn. No screams, no panic. The 5 children were unnaturally silent. The roof soon collapsed in a terrible crash. When dawn broke on Christmas morning, amidst the cold, charred debris, the most unspeakable truth emerged. A truth that defied every scientific law. Not a single trace of human remains was found. The local authorities quickly declared it an accident. But George and Jennie knew in their bones that this was no accident. This was a perfectly executed crime, and the fire was simply the perfect alibi.
The morning of December 25, 1945, was not a day for celebration in Fayetteville. It was a scene of unspeakable devastation. The beautiful Sodder home, the very emblem of George's success, was now a pile of smoking, charred wreckage. But worse than the sight of the destruction was the chilling stillness. As the sun rose over the snow-covered grounds, the surviving Sodder family members searched the ruins for any sign, any remains of their 5 missing children. This was the moment the horror truly transcended tragedy and became a full-blown nightmare. Sheriff F.J. Morris and his deputies arrived on the scene. Their approach was immediate and, to George and Jennie, infuriatingly dismissive. Sheriff Morris quickly declared the cause to be faulty wiring. George, a successful businessman, a man of logic and reason, immediately objected. He explained that he'd had the wiring professionally checked just weeks before. He pointed to the chimney, arguing that if the fire started there, the smoke pattern would be different. But the sheriff was not interested in details. He was interested in closure. The search began, and it was disorganized, brief, and utterly heartbreaking. They raked through the ashes, which were still smoking hours after the blaze. And here is where the story shifts from tragic fire to implausible crime. After only a cursory look, the search team delivered the impossible verdict. No human remains were found. Think about that for a moment. 5 children, ages 5 to 14. Fire, even the hottest of house fires, does not incinerate human bone. Experts, who would later testify for the Sodders, confirmed that teeth and major bone fragments should have survived. Even the cremation process in modern facilities leaves behind substantial bone fragments. Yet, the official narrative was that the fire had been so hot, so intense, that the children had been completely vaporized. It was a medical and scientific impossibility, but it was the official story. George Sodder, a man who built his life on hard work and honesty, felt a cold, deep fury rising in his chest. He confronted Sheriff Morris demanding a more thorough, professional search. Morris's response was chillingly simple. He suggested that the 5 children were likely cremated so completely that not even fragments remained. He wanted the case closed, sealed, and forgotten before the new year. The local coroner, a man named Tinsley, who would later regret his quick action, held a brief inquest. Based entirely on the sheriff's rushed conclusion, a death certificate was issued for all 5 children on December 30th, just 5 days after the fire. It was a swift, clean erasure of 5 young lives. But for George and Jennie, it was a declaration of war against the system that was supposed to protect them. Jennie, in her grief, began piecing together every single anomaly that the authorities had conveniently overlooked. She remembered the strange phone call from the woman asking for a name no one knew. She recalled the terrifying sound of the object rolling on the roof before the fire became noticeable. And then there were the major logistical failures, the working truck that wouldn't start and the vanished ladder. The most damning piece of evidence in George's mind was the missing ladder. He knew where he kept it. After the fire, he searched the immediate area himself. He found the ladder not incinerated, but tossed down an embankment some 75 feet away from the house. It was a clear, undeniable sign of human intervention. Someone had physically removed the ladder to ensure George could not reach the second floor. When he presented this evidence to the sheriff, it was met with a shrug and a casual explanation about panicked neighbors. The sheriff's indifference felt like a betrayal of justice. The quick closure of the case, the refusal to conduct a proper forensic investigation, and the dismissal of clear physical evidence solidified the Sodders' belief. The focus was not on finding their children, but on burying the mystery. This institutional failure fueled George's relentless, decades-long search. He realized that the greatest enemy in finding his children was not the flames, but the official denial of what truly happened that Christmas night. The local community, seeing the official verdict, began to treat the Sodders with a mixture of pity and quiet suspicion. The unspoken question was always there. If the children weren't in the ashes, where were they? And why did the police seem so eager to look away? It was a breakdown of faith in the American small-town system, a terrifying realization that the local authorities were either incompetent or complicit. For George and Jennie, this rapid official closure was the final, devastating blow. They buried their grief, replacing it with a steely, unified purpose: to prove the official verdict was a lie. They knew the fire was merely a stage, set to make 5 children disappear without a trace. And the first step of their long, agonizing campaign was to prove, scientifically, that the official claim of complete cremation was scientifically impossible. The battle against the flames had been lost quickly, but the war against the cover-up had just begun. In Part 3, George takes matters into his own hands, hiring independent investigators to prove that the evidence of their children's existence was not in the ashes, but in the sinister background details the police so casually dismissed.
For George and Jennie Sodder, the first 5 days after Christmas were a blur of unimaginable grief, compounded by white-hot rage. The official verdict of faulty wiring and complete cremation was an insult to their intelligence and an agonizing lie they refused to swallow. They were successful, working-class Americans, and their very existence was a testament to solving problems. Now they treated the tragedy not as a loss, but as a complex puzzle they alone had to solve. They started with the small details the sheriff, F.J. Morris, had so casually dismissed. First, there was the strange phone call. Jennie remembered the details perfectly. The woman's peculiar, agitated voice asking for a name no one knew. This wasn't a wrong number. It felt like a probe. A test call to see who was awake and where they were. If the fire was an accident, why the probing phone call just before the main event? The police simply recorded it as unrelated disturbance. Next, George focused on the structural sabotage. He personally went back to the smoldering debris and confirmed his worst suspicion. The main power line, not the interior wiring, had been cut. It was a clean, deliberate severance. An electrical accident doesn't cut a service line outside the house. A saboteur does. This crucial piece of evidence, when presented to the police, was again brushed aside as a natural consequence of the blaze. But George knew better. Someone had ensured the lights and any emergency systems were dead before the fire truly began. Then there was the chilling discovery of the missing ladder. The wooden extension ladder, a sturdy piece of equipment George used constantly, wasn't destroyed. George found it dumped in a ditch 75 feet away from the house. It hadn't fallen. It had been hurled. This proved unequivocally that an outside human agent was present at the scene, not to start the fire, but to prevent rescue. This was the definitive nail in the coffin of the official accident theory, yet the sheriff simply recorded it as misplaced due to panic. This deliberate negligence was not just incompetence. It felt like a systematic cover-up. The most unsettling clues came from the outside world. A few days after the fire, George spoke to a local bus driver who reported seeing a group of people, including what looked like 5 children, crammed into a car speeding down the road near Fayetteville, hours before dawn on Christmas Day. The children's sizes matched the missing Sodder children perfectly. The bus driver swore they were looking out the window, possibly in distress. This was concrete witness testimony of the children being alive and mobile after the fire started. The police? They didn't even interview the bus driver seriously, dismissing his account as mistaken identity or holiday confusion. The message was clear. The local authorities did not want a case. They wanted silence. Jennie, focusing on the past, remembered a chilling encounter from earlier that year. An insurance salesman had come to the house demanding George take out a policy. When George refused, the man, whose face Jennie remembered vividly, grew furious and issued a terrifying threat. "Your house is going up in smoke, and your children are going to be destroyed. You are going to pay for the nasty remarks you have been making about Mussolini." George, an outspoken critic of the Italian dictator, had brushed it off as an angry salesman's tantrum. Now it echoed with the sound of snapping timber and burning rage. Was this the motive? Political assassination masked as a domestic fire? Armed with these facts, the intentional power cut, the thrown ladder, the speeding car of children, and the direct death threat, George realized he couldn't rely on the local West Virginia police. His faith in the local justice system was completely shattered. The police chief had sealed his own fate by accepting a meager burial of ashes and a shoddy conclusion. George decided to mobilize his own resources. He would no longer be a victim mourning. He would become the relentless detective. His first move was hiring an independent private investigator from out of state, someone with the credibility and connections to push past the local bureaucracy. He needed an outsider to confirm what they already knew. The Sodder children were not in the ashes. The battle had moved from the ashes of the home to the court of public opinion, and George Sodder was ready to dedicate his life and fortune to exposing the truth. The long, agonizing campaign for justice had just begun. In Part 4, George pursues his theory of organized crime and faces a chilling revelation about the ashes found at the scene, and a revelation that proves the police were either negligent or actively complicit in a massive cover-up. With the local police refusing to lift a single finger, George and Jennie Sodder were left alone in a horrifying silence. But George was not a man to accept defeat, not when the lives of his 5 children were at stake. His success as a business owner wasn't built on trusting others, but on meticulous planning and relentless effort. The official verdict was clear: accident. But George knew the truth: this was sabotage, and the motive was personal. George's thoughts immediately turned to the past, and specifically to the threat from the insurance salesman Jennie had vividly recalled. The man's fury and his chilling words, "Your house is going up in smoke and your children are going to be destroyed," were too precise to be mere bluster. This led George to his first major theory. The disappearance was an act of revenge or extortion linked to his outspoken political views, or perhaps a forgotten debt from his old life. George was an immigrant who had been vocal about his contempt for the fascist regime in Italy. Had his political stance, once a point of American pride, become a liability that brought professional assassins to his doorstep? To investigate this terrifying possibility, George did what any resourceful American businessman would do. He bypassed the inept local law enforcement and hired an independent private investigator named C.C. Tinsley. Tinsley was an outsider, a seasoned professional who worked the wider region, and he carried a weight of authority that the local sheriff lacked. George gave Tinsley a simple mandate: prove the children are alive and prove the fire was a deliberate act of concealment. Tinsley's first course of action was forensic, and his findings immediately shattered the foundation of the official police report. Tinsley brought in experts to analyze the debris. Remember the local coroner's swift conclusion that the 5 children were completely incinerated? Tinsley's experts confirmed what George already knew. It was scientifically impossible. To burn 5 bodies down to nothing requires an intense, prolonged temperature of at least 2,000 to 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit, far beyond what a typical house fire could produce, especially one that burned quickly and fiercely on a cold night. The absolute lack of bone fragments was not evidence of extreme heat. It was evidence of absence. But the investigation led to an even more disturbing revelation concerning the supposed remains. Early on, Sheriff Morris had claimed that one of the deputies, upon raking the ashes, found what he believed to be internal organs, a piece of charred, dark material. Morris quickly concluded it was a human liver, and this piece of supposed evidence was hastily buried near the scene, cementing the initial verdict of death. George, driven by an unshakable need for the truth, ordered the site of the makeshift burial to be excavated. The results of this excavation were chilling, proving that the local authorities were either grossly incompetent or actively engaged in planting false evidence. The piece of human liver was sent to the Smithsonian Institution for proper forensic analysis. The expert report came back with a shocking conclusion. The material was not human. It was a mass of decomposed beef liver that had been cooked. Someone had planted the cooked animal organ at the scene to provide false evidence of incineration, thereby rushing the police to close the case and convince the grieving family that their children were indeed dead. The emotional impact of this discovery on George and Jennie was immense. It was the final devastating piece of confirmation. Their children were not casualties of an accident. They were victims of a calculated criminal act. This was no longer just a missing persons case. This was a conspiracy involving local officials who either tampered with evidence or were willfully blind to it. The realization that they had been deliberately misled, lied to, and forced to bury a piece of cooked animal offal, believing it to be their child's remains, fueled a rage that would drive them for the rest of their lives. It was a complete betrayal of their trust in the American justice system. George now had a clear objective: track down the criminal organization behind the kidnapping. He believed the attack was orchestrated not by a local criminal, but by a sophisticated, organized group, either linked to the Italian mafia due to his anti-fascist leanings or possibly an organized crime ring that specialized in child theft and ransom. His theory of faked death was now scientifically and forensically proven, and he shifted his focus from the ashes of Fayetteville to the darker corners of the national criminal underground. The journey would be long, expensive, and filled with dead ends. But George and Jennie were now unified in their mission to find the living truth behind the fatal fire. The battle was no longer against memory, but against a deep systemic lie. In Part 5, the Sodders will receive the first tangible lead since the fire. A mysterious postcard that forces George to travel across the state, chasing a glimmer of hope that leads directly into a complex web of religious and governmental secrecy. The discovery that the remains buried at the scene were nothing more than cooked beef liver was the turning point. It extinguished any lingering doubt George and Jennie had about the fire being an accident. It proved their children were alive, and it proved that powerful figures, whether local police or external criminals, were actively building a wall of lies around the truth. George redoubled his efforts, pouring his savings into hiring more private eyes and plastering the children's faces across the entire region. But the leads were cold, the silence was deafening, and the cost was astronomical. Just as hope began to turn into a bitter exhaustion, a new signal cut through the noise, a mysterious postcard. It was 1951, 6 years after the fire, when the mail delivered a small, faded postcard to the Sodder home. It was postmarked from a town in Charleston, hundreds of miles away, and contained a simple, cryptic message. The handwriting was neat, almost childlike, and the words were stark. "I know where your children are. They are in a religious institution, perhaps a convent, near here." The postcard provided no name, no address, and no motive, but it offered the one thing George and Jennie desperately needed: validation that the search was not in vain. George, seizing on this fragile thread of hope, immediately embarked on a relentless journey. He believed the religious institution wasn't just a random cover, but a highly secretive location, possibly chosen for its strict, isolated nature, making it the perfect sanctuary for concealment. His theory was that whoever kidnapped the children might have used an organized, powerful religious body to hide them, banking on the institution's tradition of silence and autonomy from secular law. This was the dark underbelly of a familiar, respected American institution, a place where questions weren't asked. His private investigator, C.C. Tinsley, confirmed that there was indeed a secluded, private convent, a type of cloistered monastery, in the Charleston area known for its extreme privacy and lack of outside contact. George drove there immediately. The scene was utterly chilling. The convent stood isolated on a quiet, snow-dusted road surrounded by high walls, an image of serene seclusion. It felt like stepping into another world, a world entirely ruled by silence and order, where the rules of West Virginia law might not apply. George requested an audience with the Mother Superior, the leader of the convent. The confrontation was a battle between a father's desperate love and a rigid institutional barrier. George, direct and forceful, explained the entire horrific story: the fire, the missing children, the planted beef liver, and the anonymous postcard. He pleaded with the Mother Superior, begging her to simply let him see the children living there to eliminate the possibility. He was willing to be discreet, willing to do anything to confirm the truth. The Mother Superior, a woman of unyielding demeanor, was equally firm. She denied everything. She claimed no knowledge of the Sodder children, denied receiving anyone new, and insisted her convent operated with the utmost transparency to God and the community. But her eyes, George noted, were cold, evasive, and seemed to hold a secret. She refused to allow George inside, citing the sanctity and privacy of their religious order. The refusal felt less like protection of privacy and more like active concealment. The confrontation reached a climax when George, driven to his breaking point, pointed out the strange timing and the absolute secrecy surrounding the convent's admission processes. He accused the Mother Superior of prioritizing the reputation of her order over the agony of a grieving family. She finally shut him down, ending the meeting abruptly and ordering the gates to be locked. George was left standing outside, defeated, his conviction stronger than ever. The children had been there, or perhaps were still there, and the convent was involved in the cover-up. This experience introduced a new, terrifying layer to the conspiracy: the involvement of a powerful, organized group, a religious or political faction, willing to use their influence and seclusion to hide the children. The fire was simply the destructive distraction. The institutional silence was the long-term prison. George realized he wasn't just fighting local police incompetence. He was fighting an established, wealthy entity that operated outside the law, hiding behind faith and tradition. He left Charleston physically exhausted but mentally galvanized. The postcard was not a cruel trick. It was a desperate attempt by someone inside the conspiracy to break the silence. The fact that the Mother Superior was so quick to shut him down proved he was close. The Sodders decided to dedicate every remaining penny to pursuing this institutional angle. They would use the media, public pressure, and their own relentless efforts to force the hidden truth into the light. In Part 6, the Sodder family makes their definitive, desperate move: the creation of the famous Billboard, turning their private tragedy into a national crusade, and demanding that America face the terrifying truth of their unsolved crime.
George Sodder left the Charleston convent empty-handed but mentally galvanized. The Mother Superior's cold refusal, combined with the earlier evidence of planted beef liver and the vanished ladder, confirmed the horrifying truth. The fire was a well-organized theatrical cover-up. The Sodder children were not lost to the flames. They were being actively hidden by a powerful entity. This realization fundamentally changed the survivors' lives. They could no longer mourn their children as dead. They had to live every day fighting for their lives as missing. The years immediately following the fire were a desolate, agonizing existence. The surviving children, especially Sylvia Sodder, who was only 2 when the fire happened, grew up haunted by the silence and the empty spaces. She was the only child still living at home at the time of the fire who did manage to survive, and she became the quiet witness to her parents' unrelenting pain. Sylvia's childhood was spent in the shadow of a profound loss, where every Christmas was a grim reminder of the night her siblings were stolen. She watched her parents transform from a happy, prosperous American family into two private detectives driven by obsession and fury. George and Jennie spent every waking moment and every spare penny chasing leads. They mortgaged their property, sold off assets from the trucking company, and emptied their savings. They followed every anonymous tip, traveling to nearly every state in the country, from Florida to New York, chasing shadows and ghosts. Each dead end was a fresh wound, but each failure only deepened their resolve. They refused to let their children be reduced to a closed file in a small-town police station. Their refusal to yield became a quiet, powerful act of rebellion against the system that had failed them. By the mid-1950s, George realized that discreet, expensive private investigation was not enough. To fight a conspiracy with deep pockets and secretive walls, he needed to leverage the one great power in America: public opinion. He needed to turn his private, local tragedy into a national crusade. His bold solution was unprecedented, dramatic, and unforgettable: the Billboard. George commissioned the construction of a massive, imposing billboard erected right on Route 19, a major highway leading into Fayetteville. This wasn't just a sign, it was a defiant declaration. The billboard displayed large, clear photographs of the 5 missing children: Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty. Below their innocent faces, it listed their names, ages, the date of the fire, and offered a $5,000 reward, a colossal sum at the time, for any information leading to their recovery. The sign was huge, stark, and impossible to ignore, forcing thousands of passing motorists to confront the uncomfortable reality of the unsolved case. The billboard was an act of genius in communication. It served multiple purposes. Firstly, it ensured that the children's faces, their vibrant reality, would not be erased by the police's lies. It was a physical public refusal to accept the death certificates. Secondly, it put immense, constant pressure on the local authorities, publicly shaming them for their shoddy, conclusive work. No matter how many times the sheriff drove past, he was forced to face the consequences of his inaction. Lastly, and most critically, it became a constant beacon of hope for the family, a symbol that the search was ongoing, that the parents were still fighting, and that the children were still remembered. The billboard quickly turned the local mystery into a national sensation. Tourists stopped to take photos. Journalists drove out to Fayetteville specifically to report on the sheer defiance of the Sodder family. The story gained traction in national papers and magazines, turning George and Jennie into reluctant public figures, symbols of the desperate parent fighting a hidden truth. This wave of publicity often led to new tips and anonymous letters, reminding the Sodders that their efforts were resonating beyond the Appalachian Mountains. However, the fame came at a cost. Many locals resented the Sodders for casting a negative light on their small town and for publicly questioning the police. George and Jennie faced whispers, skepticism, and even hostility. People questioned their sanity and their obsession. Yet they maintained the sign faithfully, updating it whenever the weather wore it down, ensuring the photographs remained clear and the reward remained public. It was their enduring, silent commitment. The billboard was not merely an advertisement. It was a promise etched in steel and paint, a vow that George and Jennie would never, ever stop looking. It became their life's work, a powerful visual testament to a belief system shattered by a crime and then rebuilt on the sheer force of a parent's love. They were ready for the next phase of the fight, dealing with the chilling new leads the publicity generated, including a devastating piece of mail that would change their search forever. In Part 7, the Sodders receive a cryptic message from a far-off place, focusing their attention on a photo that would either validate their decades of sacrifice or shatter their hearts completely.
For years, the billboard stood guard on Route 19, a steel and paint monument to George and Jennie's defiance. It was their way of shouting into the void, a constant public refusal to let the state of West Virginia forget the 5 missing children. The publicity it generated brought hundreds of tips, some cruel pranks, most dead ends, but every letter was scrutinized by Jennie, who meticulously cataloged every piece of information. Her life had become a library of loss organized by hope. Then in 1968, 23 years after the fire, a piece of mail arrived that shattered their resignation. and validated every sacrifice they had made. The package contained a single, small photograph. It was a picture of a young man in his late 20s or early 30s with dark, intense features. The striking resemblance to Louis Sodder, the missing 10-year-old, was immediate and undeniable. The facial structure, the distinctive hairline, the direct gaze, it sent a jolt of recognition through Jennie's system. Her hands trembled as she turned the photo over. Scrawled on the back in faint pencil was a chilling, cryptic message. "Louis, I love Brother Frankie. A90132. The impact on George and Jennie was seismic. This wasn't a joke. It felt like a desperate, powerful cry for help. The handwriting wasn't Louis's as a child, but the detail, Brother Frankie, was a direct private link. Frankie was the nickname of George Jr., one of the sons who survived the fire. No casual prankster or journalist would know that intimate detail. This photograph was a calculated risk by someone close to Louis, someone who knew his past and desperately wanted the Sodders to find him without fully compromising their safety. George's reaction was immediate and decisive. He had the photo enlarged, studied, and analyzed. He contacted a handwriting expert, who confirmed that the writing had been done by someone educated and possibly rushed. The cryptic number A90132 and the reference to Brother Frankie pointed to some form of organizational coding or perhaps a private identifier within the institution where the children were being held. The photograph itself suggested Louis was now living somewhere in his prime adulthood, likely in his late 20s. However, when George contacted his former contacts in the FBI and state police, the institutions he had long lost faith in, the old bureaucratic walls snapped back into place. The agents, citing the lack of verifiable origin and the age of the case, were reluctant to dedicate resources. They suggested it was a cruel hoax, a manipulation of two grieving elderly parents. The very real, tangible hope in George's hands was being dismissed as emotional fantasy by the officials sworn to uphold justice. The betrayal had come full circle. George, refusing to be dismissed, decided to use the photograph to reignite the national campaign. He updated the Route 19 billboard. He carefully placed the new haunting photo of the grown Louis next to the old childhood images. The stark contrast between the lost boy and the mysterious man staring out from the highway sign intensified the public fascination and sent a clear message. Louis is alive, and we know it. The photograph became the final, desperate focal point of the Sodder family's search. George dedicated the last years of his life and much of his remaining fortune to tracking down the photo's origin. Following vague leads that pointed toward locations as distant as Florida and Oklahoma, regions he'd never explored before, he believed that the number A90132 was a code, a geographical marker, a prison number, or a facility ID. He sought out experts in coding and cryptology, exhausting every avenue of independent investigation. But the authorities remained firm in their skepticism, refusing to launch an official inquiry based on an anonymous photograph. Their refusal was a devastating confirmation to George. The cover-up was not just a local small-town failure. It was a deep-seated institutional reluctance to admit the initial accident verdict was a catastrophic lie. This photograph, this vibrant piece of physical evidence, was the ultimate test of the system, and the system had failed again. The weight of the mystery, fueled by hope and obstructed by bureaucracy, was becoming too heavy to bear. George Sodder was aging, his health deteriorating, but his resolve was ironclad. He knew his time was running out. This final, powerful lead required a final, decisive effort. In Part 8, we explore the agonizing personal toll this decades-long obsession took on George and Jennie, leading to the ultimate fate of the determined father and the solemn promise made by the surviving daughter. The arrival of the cryptic photograph in 1968, 23 years after the flames died down, was both a monumental validation and a devastating weight. It proved that Louis was alive, but it also proved the sheer impenetrability of the conspiracy holding him. For George Sodder, the relentless years of searching, the constant conflict with authorities, and the financial drain had finally taken their toll. The iron will that had defined him was starting to falter under the physical strain of his late 60s. George had dedicated the prime of his life to this singular mission. Every penny he earned, every connection he made was funneled into tracking down shadows and chasing anonymous tips. His obsession was not just emotional, it was meticulous and all-consuming. He traveled thousands of miles, often alone, following leads that evaporated into thin air. He spent countless hours analyzing the handwriting on the photo, poring over codes and maps, desperately trying to unlock the meaning of A90132. His health began to decline rapidly, exacerbated by the constant stress and the agonizing knowledge that he was closing in on the truth, but lacked the official power to seize it. Jennie, his rock and co-conspirator, watched the man she loved, the successful immigrant who built a life from scratch, slowly being consumed by the mystery. She carried her own agony, maintaining the huge, gaudy billboard that was now the defining landmark of their existence. The sign was a double-edged sword. It kept the hope alive, but it also served as a daily, brutal reminder of their loss. While George focused on the forensic investigation and the conspiracy theories, Jennie was the keeper of the children's memories, refusing to change their bedrooms, believing that if they returned, everything should be exactly as they left it. The weight of this unresolved trauma fell heavily upon the youngest surviving child, Sylvia Sodder. As the only child at home who survived the fire, she grew up understanding the depth of the tragedy and the fierce resolve of her parents. She became the quiet anchor of the family, listening to her parents recount the evidence again and again: the cooked beef liver, the missing ladder, the strange phone call. Sylvia absorbed the story not as history, but as a sacred, continuing mission. She understood the fundamental truth that her parents were fighting for: the integrity of their memories and the existence of their siblings. In 1968, shortly after the photograph arrived, George Sodder died. He died not knowing the fate of his 5 children, but dying with the absolute conviction that they were alive. His final years were marked by a desperate, palpable sadness, the anguish of a detective who solved the case but couldn't make the arrest. His death was a devastating blow, but it was not the end of the search. It was a passing of the torch. Before his passing, George made a solemn request to Sylvia. He had spent his entire adult life fighting the injustice system, spending his fortune on lawyers and private investigators. He had done his part. He asked Sylvia and her remaining siblings to never let the billboard come down. He asked them to continue the search, to keep the faces of their brothers and sisters in the public eye, and to never accept the lie of the ashes. It was a father's final testament, an unbreakable vow demanded of his surviving kin. Jennie Sodder, though heartbroken, immediately took up the mantle. She maintained the billboard, ensuring the new photo of Louis was always clear, a defiant statement against the highway traffic and the apathy of the world. She carried the pain and the purpose for another 2 decades, until her own death in 1989. The Sodder parents died not in peace but in the constant, enduring belief that their children were waiting to be found. With both parents gone, the responsibility fell entirely to Sylvia. She honored her father's dying wish, becoming the relentless guardian of the Sodder legacy. The billboard, now a faded monument to decades of grief and dedication, remained standing. It became Sylvia's life purpose to continue funding the search, answering every new tip and challenging every fresh piece of skepticism. The family's tragedy had morphed into an American legend, a chilling reminder of a failure of justice that transcended a small town. In Part 9, we will explore the deep connections George had that may have contributed to the motive, the buried details about his past that he fought to conceal, details that could finally explain why the Sodder family was targeted. With George and Jennie gone, the physical search slowed, but the central question remained a burning ember in the hearts of the surviving Sodder siblings, particularly Sylvia. Why us? George had always maintained his innocence and portrayed himself as a self-made American success story. But the severity of the crime, the precise planning, the intentional sabotage, and the institutional cover-up suggested a motive far deeper than simple local revenge. The answer, Sylvia realized, had to lie in the single thing George rarely spoke about: his past in Italy. George Sodder was an immigrant, and while he was proud of his adopted country, his life before America held scars and secrets. George was fiercely anti-fascist, a man who had publicly and repeatedly voiced his contempt for Benito Mussolini's regime in Italy. In the early 20th century, expressing such dissent could be fatal, and often resulted in retaliation not just against the dissenter, but against their family. The threat from the insurance salesman Jennie remembered: "You are going to pay for the nasty remarks you have been making about Mussolini," suddenly took on a terrifying new weight, suggesting that George's political outspokenness had followed him across the Atlantic. Sylvia began consulting with her older siblings and private investigators, urging them to look deeper into the possibility of an organized crime or political vendetta. Was it possible that an agency, perhaps linked to the remnants of the fascist regime or even the rising power of the Italian mafia, had decided to make an example of George? The kidnapping of the children, a targeted, deeply personal act, would be the ultimate form of retribution, designed not to kill, but to inflict a life sentence of psychological torture. Investigators uncovered a disturbing rumor connected to George's early business dealings. Before establishing his successful hauling company, George was rumored to have had a tense relationship with a local faction of an organized crime ring operating in the Italian-American communities of West Virginia. These groups were known for protection rackets, insurance fraud, and, chillingly, for using family members as leverage. The theory suggested the fire wasn't just political. It was a complex extortion plot that went wrong, or perhaps a twisted payment demanded by powerful figures George had crossed decades earlier. The most compelling piece of evidence supporting this deeper conspiracy was the level of precision in the crime. The power line was cut before the fire, the ladder was removed before George could use it, and the cooked beef liver was planted after the fire to mislead investigators. This required not just one person, but a coordinated team. A team with surveillance capabilities, access to forensics, and protection from local law enforcement. This was far beyond the scope of a jealous neighbor or a lone arsonist. This spoke to the quiet, efficient machinations of a well-funded, organized power. Furthermore, the recurring theme of institutional silence was consistent with organized crime. If the kidnappers had political or mafia ties, they would have the power to suppress police investigations, bribe local officials, or utilize closed institutions like the convent George visited in Part 5 for hiding the children. The local sheriff's strange compliance, the coroner's hurried verdict, and the FBI's later reluctance to pursue the photographic evidence all pointed towards a quiet, invisible hand pulling the strings of local justice. Sylvia's realization was agonizing. Her father had built a beautiful, honest life, but the ghosts of his past had reached across the ocean to exact a terrible price. She understood George's final urgent plea. He hadn't just been fighting for his children. He had been fighting to expose the shadow forces that permeated even the idyllic small-town American landscape. The Sodder case was a direct confrontation between the promise of American freedom and the long reach of global malice. With this new perspective, the search entered its final, most focused phase. Sylvia was no longer searching for 5 missing children. She was searching for the secret ledger of her father's life. She knew that to find Louis, Martha, and the others, she had to unearth the identity of the person, or the organization, that had truly felt threatened by George Sodder. Her renewed purpose was fueled by the cold logic of crime and the enduring love of family. In Part 10, Sylvia will confront the remaining possibilities and examine the most chilling alternative theories, including the sinister idea that the children's whereabouts were known all along, but kept a secret for their own safety.
With the conviction that her father's anti-fascist past was the true motive, Sylvia Sodder entered the most critical phase of the search. She was no longer just chasing shadows. She was searching for a specific, organized entity capable of pulling off such a perfect disappearance. Yet, even with this hardened focus, the truth remained stubbornly out of reach. The Sodder case was a well-constructed labyrinth, and Sylvia found herself confronting several terrifying, mutually exclusive possibilities that complicated her mission and challenged her resolve. The primary theory, fueled by the planted beef liver and the cryptic photo, remained the organized crime kidnapping, that the children were seized by a group, possibly linked to the mafia or political extremists, and raised under new identities to punish George. If this were true, the children, now fully grown adults, would likely have no memory of their past. They would have new names, new lives, and may be completely unaware of the horrifying tragedy that stole their childhood. This possibility brought with it a profound and agonizing question for Sylvia. If she found them, would they even want to be found? Would revealing the truth destroy the lives they had been forced to build? But a dark, alternative theory, often whispered by family friends and former investigators, suggested a far more complex scenario: the protective concealment. This theory proposed that the children were indeed removed from the house before the fire, but not by a hostile force. What if George, knowing his anti-Mussolini rhetoric had put his family in danger, as evidenced by the insurance salesman's threat, had secretly arranged for his children to be taken by trusted associates? Perhaps a close friend or even a political ally had organized the removal, using the fire as a perfect, devastating cover to make them disappear and enter a federal or private witness protection program. If this protective concealment theory held true, it would fundamentally change the narrative. George Sodder would not be a victim of a crime, but a co-conspirator in an elaborate, necessary deception. His public anguish, his relentless search, and the maintenance of the billboard would all have been a carefully managed performance. A brilliant, decades-long cover story designed to convince his enemies, and even his own wife, that he was desperate and unaware. This possibility explained the uncanny perfection of the crime. George would have had the insight to disable the truck and remove the ladder, knowing that the fire was merely a smokescreen. Sylvia wrestled with this idea daily. It offered a measure of comfort, the possibility that her siblings had been raised safely, but it introduced a shattering personal betrayal. Did her father let her mother suffer 2 decades of agonizing grief for the sake of their safety? Did her father, whom she revered, knowingly let her grow up without her siblings? It was a psychological knot Sylvia felt compelled to untangle. There was no concrete proof, yet the possibility explained why the authorities were so quick to close the case. They were asked to. Adding to the complexity was the potential involvement of the local corruption beyond mere negligence. An investigator once confided in Sylvia a terrifying local rumor: that the children were quickly smuggled out of West Virginia by an organized ring that supplied children for illegal adoptions in other states, primarily New Jersey. This theory explained the local police's extreme haste and the planted beef liver, suggesting they were bribed or intimidated to look the other way, allowing the initial crime scene to be irreparably compromised. It was the darkest implication that her siblings' disappearance was fueled not by ideology, but by simple, heartless greed. Sylvia continued to maintain the billboard, which was now a landmark of American true crime history, knowing that every single one of these theories relied on finding a single living person: Louis, Martha, Maurice, Jenny, or Betty. The billboard was the only remaining link to the past, the only public challenge to the conspiracy of silence. She realized her inheritance was not wealth, but a duty, a debt to her parents and her missing siblings. Her mission was now clear. She needed to find the source of the 1968 Louis photograph. That image, the man with the code A9032, was the only tangible evidence that broke through all the theories. It didn't matter how Louis was taken. It only mattered where he was now. Sylvia dedicated her time to cross-referencing that code number with known adoption agencies, witness protection databases, and even organized crime archives, believing that if her father's theories were right, the key lay in the numbers. The search had become a lonely, meticulous cryptographic hunt, forcing Sylvia to confront the very real possibility that the final truth might be too painful or too dangerous to ever fully accept. In Part 11, the final hours of George and Jennie Sodder are revisited, focusing on their last, desperate attempts to find their children and the enduring promise that the Sodder name would never let the mystery die.
By the late 1960s, the Sodder home, despite its vibrant surviving family, was steeped in the pervasive sadness of an unfinished mission. George Sodder, in his final years, carried the heavy emotional and financial weight of the search. The endless travel, the relentless pursuit of unreliable leads, and the constant psychological warfare with the authorities had broken his health. He knew his time was running out, and the agony of leaving his children's fate unresolved was a heavier burden than any he had carried during his working life. George's failing health forced him to confront the limits of his own investigation. He had spent his fortune, but he couldn't buy the truth. He began spending long hours with his youngest surviving daughter, Sylvia, who had grown up absorbing the trauma and the details of the crime. In those final, quiet conversations, George made his deepest confessions, revealing the full extent of his fear and his convictions. He confided in Sylvia about the Italian political threats he had received, the ones he had dismissed to Jennie as mere sales rhetoric. He admitted his terrifying suspicion that the crime was not a local act of malice, but a long-reaching vendetta targeting him specifically. George's greatest regret, and perhaps his final silent confession, was the way the pursuit had consumed Jennie. He had forced his wife to live a life perpetually frozen in 1945, clinging to hope that was often agonizingly thin. He apologized not for searching, but for the life of perpetual grief he had imposed. But Jennie always reassured him. Her strength came from his conviction. She understood that giving up on the search meant accepting a lie, and that was something neither of them could bear. In 1968, shortly after the haunting photo of Louise arrived, George Sodder died. He passed away still clinging to the belief that the man in the photograph was his son. His death was profound, marking the end of the first, most active phase of the search. His funeral was a somber affair, but the lingering presence of the massive billboard, now updated with Louis's grown face, served as a powerful, defiant testament. The fire may have taken his children, but the conspiracy had not broken his resolve. Jennie Sodder, though devastated, immediately honored the legacy. She refused to sell the house or liquidate the rest of their assets. She became the solitary caretaker of the memory and the mission. For 2 more decades, until her own passing in 1989, she faithfully maintained the Route 19 billboard. She hired maintenance workers to repaint the sign when it faded and replace the photos when the weather warped them. The act was ritualistic, a daily public affirmation that the children were still loved, still missed, and still counted among the living. Jennie's persistence ensured the mystery never died. She dedicated her life to analyzing every incoming lead, no matter how faint or unreliable. She believed deeply in the Louise photo, often stating that the eyes in the adult face were the same as the boy she lost. Jennie's enduring vigil provided the crucial emotional fuel that kept the case alive in the public consciousness, decades after George's death. She proved that the strength of a mother's conviction could overcome the apathy of a corrupt bureaucracy. Before Jennie's death, she passed the sacred obligation entirely to Sylvia. Sylvia, who had lived her whole life in the shadow of the fire, accepted the mission not as a burden but as her inheritance. She understood that the billboard was now a part of her parents, a physical extension of their unyielding hope. Her final promise to her dying mother was simple and absolute: the billboard stays up. The search continues. The passing of George and Jennie marked the end of the direct investigation, but the start of the Sodder legacy as an enduring American cold case. The case was now in the hands of the second generation, who brought with them new perspectives, new technologies, and the same fierce determination. Sylvia's quiet, meticulous commitment ensured that the Sodder family tragedy would continue to challenge the official narrative of an accident and keep the terrifying possibility of an orchestrated kidnapping alive. In Part 12, we will bring the case into the present day, exploring the final chilling conclusions reached by the survivors and the enduring question that haunts the small town of Fayetteville. With George and Jennie Sodder gone, the silent burden of the missing children fell squarely upon Sylvia and the surviving siblings. The search transitioned from a furious hands-on hunt to a meticulous digital age crusade. Sylvia, honoring her father's dying wish, ensured that the Route 19 billboard never came down. It remains a faded, silent sentinel, a haunting artifact of the past, still asking the same agonizing questions of every motorist who drives by Fayetteville. It is the final testament to their unwavering belief that the children are out there. As the decades passed, the Sodder case became a cornerstone of American true crime, analyzed and debated by experts across the country. The overwhelming scientific consensus supports George's conviction. The official verdict was a lie. The evidence of the cooked beef liver, the missing ladder, the cut power line, all point unequivocally to a meticulously planned kidnapping. The fire was not a cause of death. It was the ultimate criminal misdirection. But the core mystery remains. Where are they? Sylvia and her family continue to grapple with the multiple chilling theories, ranging from organized crime revenge to protective concealment, or perhaps the darkest theory of an illegal adoption ring facilitated by corrupt local officials. Sylvia, the last direct witness to her parents' unrelenting sorrow, is convinced that the man in the 1968 Louis photograph holds the key. The code A90132 is the final piece of the puzzle, a secret identity hidden in plain sight. She believes that someone, somewhere, knows who that man is, knows his adopted name, and knows the truth about his 4 missing siblings. The technology of the 21st century, DNA databases, facial recognition, and the vast global reach of the internet now offer new tools her father could only dream of. The legacy of the Sodder disappearance lies in its agonizing ambiguity. It is a terrifying American legend because it proves that sometimes the authorities you trust are the ones who betray you, and sometimes the most horrific crimes are executed with clinical, perfect precision. The fire was merely a stage. The last rule of the fire that never died is this: the perpetrators never intended to kill the children. They intended to destroy the lives of George and Jennie, condemning them to a lifetime of searching for ghosts. Now, after almost 80 years, the question is passed to you. The Sodder family has done everything they could. They spent their fortune, they suffered their agonizing loss in the public eye, and they kept the hope alive. They fulfilled their vow. Now we must fulfill ours. The children, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie, and Betty, are out there, grown with families of their own, perhaps unaware of the mystery that surrounds their birth. If you have ever heard the name Louis Sodder, or encountered a middle-aged individual who suddenly appeared in a small town around the 1950s or 60s, a person whose background is unusually opaque, a person with an uncanny resemblance to the children on that billboard, we need you to act. Do not let the system's incompetence win. Do not let the fire have the final word. The Sodder billboard still stands, a monument to a father's unyielding promise. The children are waiting for their story to be fully told, their lives to be finally confirmed. If you have information, contact the Sodder family directly or the appropriate national cold case agencies. Do not let this file close in silence. Look around you. Look at your neighbors. Look at the people in the shadows. Are you absolutely certain that the faces on that billboard aren't closer than you think? Thank you for listening. The search is not over.